Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out this morning. My name is Matt Riley. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate and vegetation change in the Northwest Forest Plan area. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors on this chapter, Tom Spies, Jeremy Littell, Ramona Butts, and John Kim. Climate change is expected to alter forested ecosystems across the Northwest Forest Plan area. Increases in atmospheric CO2 and temperature, as well as altered precipitation and disturbance regimes, will likely have profound effects on biodiversity and the delivery of ecosystem services over the next century. The region is very geographically complex and encompasses almost 25 million hectares of forest land. These include multiple physiographic provinces or ecoregions.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Better?
Okay.
These physiographic regions share similar environment, topography, and climate, as well as shared legacies of past land use and management, and provide a good framework for breaking down the area geographically. Climate is much cooler and wetter towards the north in the inland mountains and along the coast, and then becomes increasingly warmer and drier, with greater inter-seasonal variability and precipitation in the summer as you get further south into Northern California. Of course, most of the precipitation falls in the wintertime, often it's snow at higher elevations. The ecological interactions and diversity of biophysical settings across the region are complex. In this broad range of environmental and climatic gradients, it's represented in a variety of potential vegetation zones, is how we call them. These potential vegetation zones serve as a framework to break the region down ecologically. And basically they represent unique sets of biophysical conditions, things like topography and climate, and they can be characterized by similar species compositions, disturbance regimes, and pathways to structural development. And really these vegetation zones provide a great ecological framework for discussing the effects of climate and vegetation change across such a broad geographic extent. The vegetation zones are named for the climax vegetation types that would theoretically develop in the absence of disturbance. So for example, Western hemlock, one of the dominant vegetation zones on the west side of the region, is currently dominated by Douglas fir, the early cereal conifer. Likewise, grand fir or white fir, which is more common to the drier eastern side, is most often dominated by ponderosa pine. And so existing or current vegetation often varies within these zones depending on cereal stage or time since disturbance. Wet and moist vegetation zones make up most of the region to the west, but the drier vegetation zones become increasingly important to the eastern part of the region and especially to the south as you get into Northern California. This wet-dry characterization is a little bit oversimplistic, as a range of environmental conditions or precipitation can vary considerably even within a single vegetation zone. The climate and vegetation of the region have gone through continuous change over the last 12,000 years during the Holocene. This is basically the period that we refer to since the last major glaciation. There's a rich literature of paleoecological studies across the region from Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. These studies use charcoal and pollen from sediment cores taken from lakes to recreate past vegetation communities and how they've changed over time. These studies are limited in terms of their spatial and give sort of a coarse temporal resolution. They usually come from single lakes, as you can see on this dot here in Washington. But they offer really important historical context in terms of the changes that the climate and vegetation have gone through on the scales of thousands of years. These studies across the region document how complex interactions between a fluctuating climate and fire have changed vegetation over time, and most of them generally agree that the current vegetation assemblages that we recognize today were established sometime between 5,000 and 2,500 years ago. Climate and fire have also fluctuated over the last 1,000 years. The warmest temperatures occurred during the medieval climate anomaly, which was approximately about 900 to 1,200 years. which was warmer and wetter during the winter during this time for about 300 years. And then the coldest periods occurred more recently during what we call the Little Ice Age. Here, winters were much colder and drier, and this lasted from about 1400 to about 1850. And the figure we're looking at here shows the occurrence of those two patterns, as well as fluctuations in sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific. During the last 1,000 years, what we call this word teleconnections, which is basically just a linkage between climate and weather and these sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific. And over the last 1,000 years, these have become more important over time. And there's two particular teleconnections that are really pertinent to the Northwest Forest Plan area. The first one is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. There's a little bit less known about this, but it's generally this phase shift between warm and cool periods that can last anywhere from, I don't know, 20 to 50 years. And then on shorter time scales, El Nino Southern Oscillation is a little bit more predictable and varies about every 2 to 7 years. And so during El Nino years, it's usually warmer and drier than normal in the wintertime. And then La Nina, the alternative phase, it's much wetter and cooler, usually associated with big snow years. And so the relationship with ENSO, El Nino, and PDO is much stronger towards the north as you get into Washington. And then as you head south into Northern California, the relationship is much weaker. So the climate there is less tied to sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. More recently, over the last 100 years, temperature increases during the 20th century have exceeded global averages and equate to approximately 1 degree Celsius. Here you can see consistent trends from 3 different data sources, averaged across all of Oregon and Washington. On the x-axis is time. This is basically the last century. And then on the y-axis, it's the departure from normal. So those values where the line falls above the 0 line, those are basically warmer than normal. And the ones that fall below are generally cooler than normal. And what you can see is that the temperature basically has fluctuated, and then there was a marked increase approximately 1980. This also corresponds when we've really seen large increases in fire activity in the region. Since the 1980s, warming has occurred in all seasons with the exception of spring. And there's evidence supporting both anthropogenic climate change and change associated with natural variability. So things like PDO and ENSO play a role as well. But the changes that we have seen cannot be explained by natural factors alone. This is a similar figure showing precipitation trends for the last century. Again, it's the same thing. When the line is above that 0 mark, it means it's wetter than normal, and when it falls below, it means it's drier than normal. And so these trends have been far more variable over time, depend on season. You can see how precipitation has fluctuated at decadal scales. Approximately from 1920 to 1940, it was really, really dry. It sort of corresponds with the Dust Bowl. And starting about the 1950s to the 1980s, it was getting far more sun and far less fog than they're used to. Other exceptional things, prolonged heat waves accompanied by extremely high temperatures, as well as intensified hydrologic regimes. It's really most evident in Northern California over the last 3 to 5 years. And there are remote sensing studies that indicate that most of the vegetation zones across the region have already experienced moisture stress associated with some of these changes. Ecologically, these recent changes in climate have also affected tree demographic rates, specifically growth and mortality. These include increased mortality rates of old growth forests since the 1960s. This is a study from Phil Van Manken looking at old growth forests across the western United States, and you can see the Pacific Northwest in the black line. Mortality rate almost doubled over this time. So 0.5% per year may not seem like much, but over time, these compound, and when you get up to 1.5% per year, it really adds up over time. These are generally associated with increases in pathogen and insect activity from drought. And all we know, there have been cumulative losses in basal area and density in these forests. There's generally poor understanding of how recent mortality has changed other attributes of structure, composition, or how these differ across the region. The potential response of tree growth to climate change differs substantially among species, as well as geographically, and depends primarily on the factors that limit growth in different parts of the region. So in areas where water is limiting to growth, trees have experienced decreased growth because of lack of water. But in other systems, such as the higher elevation systems, higher elevation forests, where growth is really limited by growing season length or energy inputs, there's actually been an increase in growth so far. Of course, a notable increase in wildfire activity across the region. The wetter parts of the region have experienced relatively little recent fire, but wildfire activity has absolutely increased across the drier parts of the region to the east and to the south, and certainly this year and the last few years. Continued evidence of that. Increases in the frequency and extent of fires have been attributed to longer fire seasons, earlier snowmelt, warmer spring and summer temperatures, as well as decreased summer precipitation. The effects of these recent fires have been extremely variable across the region. Most fire activities occurred the Eastern Cascades, the Western Cascades of Oregon, and then particularly in the Klamath Mountains in Southern Oregon, California. Fire severity has been related to climate and drought at really broad spatial scales, but we haven't seen really any evidence of increases in the proportion of the area burned. It's actually burning at high severity. There's consensus that dry forests are actually experiencing far less fire than they would have given historical conditions. But in those fires that are occurring, we're seeing greater proportions of high severity fire, as well as much larger patches than we think happened historically. Looking forward into the future, this figure shows a range of potential outcomes in terms of temperature. And you can see in the gray, these are basically model predictions of the past. And then where it turns into red and blue, these show projections for future scenarios. And let's see, the projections represent a range of potential outcomes under 4 of these different scenarios. These RCPs, and they range from 2.5, 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5. These are the result of possible future trends in things like human population growth, economic and technological development, energy systems, as well as social beliefs and values that affect human behaviors that in turn affect climate change and CO2 output. All 4 scenarios project warming across all 4 seasons, with the greatest increases occurring during the summer and fall months. Under RCP 8.5, which is the business as usual scenario, much of the region is projected to depart what we know of historical climate by 2050. At this point, the mean annual temperature of a given location will exceed the 20th century range. So lots of confidence that we're going to see a much warmer future. This is another figure, but it shows the projections for precipitation. And again, these are at broad spatial scales across all of Oregon and Washington. What these figures are. And so we have the different scenarios along the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the precipitation change, and it's basically as a percent of the 1950 to approximately 2000 average And there's more uncertainty in these precipitation projections, but most of them suggest that we may be a little bit wetter in the future, at least on an annual basis. These changes range from 4% in our CP 2.6, almost an 8% increase under 8.5 in a more extreme scenario. But it's really, really important to remember how these differ by season. This is really the catch here. And so the projections are talking about increased precipitation in winter and spring, of course, with warmer temperatures. But there's also a pretty consistent agreement that we're going to see decreases in precipitation in the summer and fall. So this has important implications for things like growing and wildfires. So ecologically, these changes in temperature and precipitation will most likely affect vegetation by altering the availability of water in the soil through changes in the amount and the timing of when precipitation falls. Hotter droughts and greater deficits in water balance. And water balance is defined, it equates to basically the difference between the atmospheric demand for water and the amount that the soil actually has for vegetation to use. And so even if precipitation continues to increase in the future, projected increases in temperature could reduce the amount of moisture that's available for plants to use in the soil. This is a figure, these are projections from Jeremy Littell, water balance deficit across the region. Most of the temperature and precipitation studies are done at really broad state levels. And so this is a really nice reference here that we got from Jeremy looking at water balance deficit into the mid to later part of the 21st century. And you can see how it varies geographically. Most of the region is expected to be drier during the summer, especially to the east and to the south. Though it looks like mountainous areas up in the North Cascades of Washington could actually become a little bit wetter. When thinking about the projections of climate change, it's important to remember that these projections, the grid cells that we view at are really, really coarse. I think 800 meters is a fine scale climate change projection. And so the effects of climate change at smaller scales within a landscape are very, very likely to vary, especially in heterogeneous mountainous environments. Differences in vegetation structure and topography can drive fine-scale variation in temperature extremes, with differences in the maximum and the minimum temperatures of similar magnitude to those predicted into the future. Complex topography and dense old-growth vegetation have the potential to mitigate some effects of climate change, and potentially to provide diffusion from these changes that we expect to see into the future. Future fire activity. There's a number of studies out there. This is just a short list from some of the studies that are in the science synthesis document. And they use a variety of different methods. They also look at a variety of different response variables to characterize fire activity, large fire occurrence, area burn, fire probability. Not very many of them predict fire severity. This is a little bit more complex, and a lot of these models don't necessarily incorporate feedbacks with fuels and things like that. But there's pretty consistent agreement that we'll see more fire into the next century. And obviously this year, the last couple of years, we've been seeing those trends play out. Biotic disturbances, things like pathogens and insects. Activity is expected to increase as trees experience more stress related to drought, less soil moisture, but the implication and magnitude of their effects are pretty complex and variable. They'll differ geographically as well as among species. In addition to climate change affecting the host trees by increasing stress in those trees, climate change will also alter the behavior of the pathogens and insects themselves. In areas where pathogens typically infest drought-affected species, it's likely to see increases, specifically in pathogens that do really, really well in hot conditions. In terms of moist conditions, it's a little bit more complex because you have more droughts come along later in the summer. So those are more complex, but Several non-native pathogens are particular consideration: Swiss needle cast, sun note death, and white pine blister rust. In terms of what we expect to see into the next century in terms of changes in vegetation, there are several studies that use what we call mechanistic simulation models to project broad shifts in the distributions of biomes or vegetation types. Dynamic global vegetation models, DVGMs, things like MC2, a couple examples of these. These are process models that predict ecosystem processes along with the distribution, again, of these specific biomes or vegetation types. And so when I say a biome, these are much broader than the vegetation zones that we started introducing earlier. And so some of these biomes or vegetation types are deciduous forest, warm mixed forest, coniferous forest, subalpine forest. And what you're seeing here is basically, historical is basically the current distribution. The brown is coniferous forests and woodlands. This is basically the area from the Columbia River Gorge to the Willamette National Forest. And the turquoise is subalpine forests. As you look into the future, this particular model obviously projects large losses in subalpine forests, large increases in warm mixed forests, and decreases in coniferous forests, especially towards the south. So there's a whole number of studies out there that use these sorts of models, and in terms of agreement among studies, that some of the take-home messages include loss of subalpine forests, except up in the Northern Cascades of Washington, losses of conifer forest and increased dominance of hardwoods, particularly to the southern part of the area in Northern California, Southwest Oregon. There's been little agreement on dry coniferous forests, so some of the mixed conifer systems we see on the east side. And in general, these models predict persistence of the maritime marine conifer forests along the coast. Cumulatively in the literature, we pulled out several specific vulnerabilities, and this is just an abbreviated list that we've already talked about. So we can expect decreased growth and increased mortality in dry forests where conditions to growth are water limited, larger fires with more area burned, increases in non-native species, so these include non-native plant species as well as pathogens, decreased coastal summer fog in Northern California along the Redwood Coast, losses of subalpine forests with the exception in the north, and then loss of conifer forests in the south. There's several adaptation options to climate change. These include management actions aimed at standing landscape scales to reduce some of the vulnerabilities that we've identified. Jessica Holofsky and Dave Peterson provide a really great summary of these in one of their reports. This is an abbreviated list of some of those options. They developed a series of science-managed partnerships across the northwestern United States and met with managers to come up with these really large lists. And some of these strategies include manipulation of standing landscape structure, increased resilience to drought, fire, and insect activity, increasing connectivity between old growth habitats to facilitate migration of species from north to south, and then monitoring to facilitate early detection and rapid response to ongoing changes that we're seeing. Mitigation efforts include those efforts aimed at increasing carbon sequestration in forest ecosystems. This figure shows a couple scenarios with different harvest scenarios. And one of the big findings is that longer harvest rotations have the potential to increase carbon stores, particularly in the Morse forests on the west side. In dry forests on the east side, carbon will likely be less stable, specifically given the projected increases in fire activity. Fuel reduction may reduce losses of carbon in dry forests compared with the consequences of lots of high severity fire. But at current rates, the probability of fires burning areas that have been treated are relatively low. And so slight differences in the losses associated with fire compared to those when the biomass is removed, they're unlikely to make this a viable mitigation strategy into the future. And then finally, just to wrap it up in conclusion, Models predict warmer temperatures pretty consistently with wetter winters, potentially wetter springs, but we're going to see drier summers into the 21st century. The greatest changes that we can expect to see are projected in the drier and eastern southern portions of the region. And then finally, because it's such a geographically diverse area, consideration of biophysical setting will absolutely be essential when developing strategies for mitigation and adaptation to climate change.